Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our plenary panel on strategic foresight and climate risk assessment across sectors. My name is Lily Boland, and as Pauline just mentioned, I'm from the Converging Risks Lab, which is an institute at the Council on Strategic Risks, where I serve as the Strategic Foresight Fellow. So it's a pleasure to be with you all as we kick off this breakout session on climate security action and knowledge exchange across the community of practice. I'm a Foresight practitioner with a background in wargame design and facilitation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. My job is to utilize Foresight and other mixed methodologies to help policymakers, experts, thought leaders, and military officials navigate uncertainty, particularly around complex and converging challenges such as climate and security. I find experimenting with such tools a really unique method to prompt cognitive changes about the way that we perceive and respond to the future of a given topic. Yesterday, we spent some time discussing some of the current and intersecting climate security challenges and risks shaping defense and global stability. Today, we're going to look at the opportunities for knowledge sharing and cross-sectoral cooperation on managing these risks. One such tool for doing so is strategic foresight. This plenary conversation will explore how different sectors, from policy and defense to intelligence and civil society, are using foresight and climate risk assessments to anticipate and respond to the security dynamics posed by climate change. Let me quickly define two key terms that will ground our conversation today. The first is strategic foresight. So, strategic foresight is a systematic approach to exploring plausible futures. It involves tools such as scenario planning, horizon scanning, backcasting to help decision makers prepare for uncertainty, challenge their assumptions, and build more resilient strategies. Foresight's not about predicting the future. It's about expanding our understanding of what could happen. When we think about climate tipping points, for example, foresight prompts us to observe the precursors leading up to a culminating tipping point so that we might improve readiness and preparedness before we tip over into a system-wide change. And the second term is climate risk assessment. On the other hand, that involves identifying, analyzing, and evaluating the potential impacts of climate change on systems, including infrastructure, populations, economies, agriculture, national security, and more. Increasingly, these assessments look not only at direct environmental impacts, but also at second and third order effects. So how climate risks interact with political, economic, and social systems, and how they might drive conflict, displacement, and other security stressors. This is why foresight is a particularly useful approach for identifying and getting ahead of those more indirect and uncertain future impacts. So today's panel is going to explore how the integration of foresight and climate risk assessments is actually happening in practice. We'll hear how defense organizations are applying foresight to anticipate security risks, how proactive risk management can build resilience, how policy institutions are working to embed future thinking into decision making, and how participatory approaches are helping bridge the gap between science and policy. Our panelists bring deep expertise from across disciplines and sectors, and I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone before turning the mic over. So I'm joined by Ms. Esther Babson, Climate Change and Security Lead at NATO Allied Command Transformation, Dr. Benjamin Pohl, Head of Climate Diplomacy and Security at Adelphi, and a member of the German National Interdisciplinary Climate Risk Assessment, or NICE Consortium. Ms. Marie-Sophie Meyer, a political scientist and climate security specialist, and Professor Francesco Corvaro, the climate envoy of the Italian government. I'll begin by inviting each of them to introduce themselves and answer a short opening question to help frame their perspective. Then we'll move into a second round of questions that dive a bit deeper into the challenges and opportunities within this space. After that, we'll open it up to all of you for questions. So with that, let's get started. I'll first turn it over to Ms. Babson from NATO. Esther, could you please start us off and introduce yourself, and also perhaps speak to how NATO is using foresight approaches or frameworks to assess climate security risks and ensure that those insights actually influence policy decisions?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Lily, for having me on this panel and just the wonderful talent and expertise in this room. I'm really honored to be here. So just a quick on my background, I've built my career in the climate security space and spent the last few years in the Pentagon working as the climate advisor to the Air Force and then for the Undersecretary for Acquisitions and Sustainment. So the cliche that we've all heard is that we're living in unprecedented times, and that is true in many ways. We're seeing the hottest year on record last year, the rise of AI and disinformation, and the growing uncertainty in geopolitics. And to assess this, and as Lily pointed out, we really need to be proactive. And part of being proactive to maintain that competitive edge is using foresight to ensure that we're informing our decision makers for our infrastructure, our equipment, and our most important resource, our people. So I wanted to briefly go back to what General Scott mentioned yesterday so eloquently around how NATO thinks about climate change, and then also go into a little on the foresight work that we do. So NATO recognizes that climate change is a defining challenge of our time. We've heard this multiple times now. And the impact it will have on both our allies and our adversaries. And that will only intensify, particularly if state and non-state actors defer action. So where I work at the Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, our team is tasked with developing the strategic foresight analysis and the future operating environment documents. For those unfamiliar, essentially what those documents do is help inform decision makers, both at ACT and in Brussels, on what that potential futures that Lily mentioned will look like. So we look at the social, the technological, the environmental, the economic, and the political components to really understand and paint a picture of what that could look like. So talking a little bit about how we're integrating climate change. We released the Strategic Foresight Analysis 23, which included climate change as a key defining challenge of our time. And as part of that, we are building on the next Strategic Foresight Analysis, which actually is due out to come out the end of this year. And that will really expand on that and continue with the themes that we've seen in the past. So I obviously am going to promote it and say, please keep an eye out. And, that document, I think, is just a really great opportunity to understand how NATO is thinking about the future and what we envision as those plausible futures could be. And I think what I really want to point out as my last point before I turn it back is the importance of what my role is. And that is to take those documents, take the climate change and security impact assessments that was created, the strategic foresight analysis, the future operating environment, and turn those into actually actionable solutions. And that, I think, is where we really need to work on breaking down stovepipes, talking with both the innovation teams, the defense planners, the acquisition officials, not just at places like this, but throughout the process to make sure that we're really getting this integrated throughout all key components. Because we can't keep climate security as it has been in this little bucket on the side. And I will admit, while I was in the Pentagon, we did do that a little bit at times. So I think this is a real great opportunity for all of us here to take this home and to continue this conversation with all the individuals we had here. So, the output that I'm hoping for, which is maybe a little optimistic, is to really have at the end of all of my 3 years, at least at NATO, having something that is truly actionable and that we can take that going forward and hopefully share with all of you all to have those lessons learned. So with that, I'll turn it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I'm really excited to hear about the report when it comes out, and I'll keep my eyes peeled. And your point about institutionalizing foresight to develop more proactive decision-making on a daily basis is really setting the stage for kind of our broader discussion today. With that, I now want to turn it over to Dr. Benjamin Pohl, who brings a perspective from the intelligence and strategic policy world. Benjamin, welcome. After your introduction, could you please speak to how foresight might be leveraged for integrating climate security into strategic frameworks?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks also from my side for having me here. So my name is Ben. I work for Adelphi, so not really an intelligence organization, but we had the privilege of working with our Foreign Intelligence Service last year on producing a national interdisciplinary climate risk assessment for Germany to sort of try to see what climate change actually then means for national security. Maybe just very quickly on Adelphi, where I work, it's a think-a-do tank based in Berlin, working on all aspects of sustainability. And the program that I lead on climate diplomacy and security essentially works on two levels. So one is sort of building that very fundamental awareness of the dependence of our security, of our civilization on its environmental foundations, as the Defense Minister of Canada just underlined much more eloquently than I can do now. So working across sort of the big international fora to put that awareness more strongly into these fora, which very often are somewhat siloed. I mean, everyone beats up on silos. I think there's very good reasons for having them, for having specialization, and a lot of our prosperity, of course, comes from this specialization. But at the same time, there is a tendency then for certain issues that don't fit into one of these silos to fall through the cracks. And I think climate security has been one of these topics where, the security sector has been saying, well, we don't necessarily fully understand the climate science, not the security sector as such, but the institutions that are there for managing. It's not really our task, and those managing the sort of global environmental commons as well have said, well, you go to any COP, they say we have enough problems. We don't need the additional problems that you're bringing. But of course, the issue and the risk is there and needs to be dealt with. So that's sort of the awareness building at the global level across these institutions, and then there is a sort of a second level of breaking it down for very specific contexts. So usually fragile contexts around the world where we do research and then sort of consulting on and accompaniment of security and foreign policy and development actors on how the political economy of sort of the interaction between environmental risks and pre-existing other governance risks, how this plays out, and then what can be done in terms of entry points. And then, of course, we try whenever we can to connect these two levels and sort of feedback some of the things that we can see in the field on the ground back to these policy levels. To your question as to how the Foresight then adds value to the more traditional climate risk assessments, I think it's in many ways we all love to be able to quantify the risks we are facing, and it's a very good way of trying to sort of weigh them up against each other and to decide what to prioritize and so on. I think the traditional climate risk assessments speak to that sort of ability to quantify, and of course that's really important for political decision making. But the moment you start to consider second, third, and maybe even further order impacts, the modeling becomes much less useful, simply because, of course, you can build a model where all this comes in, but the results will just be sort of your assumptions that you put into the model grinning back at you, right? These systems are so complex that it's really, really tough to quantify, and then the sort of natural response is to be conservative and to only quantify what you think you can easily quantify, and then that will give you a very conservative estimate of the risk, a much too conservative estimate of the risk. So if we look at the way economics has tried to assess climate risks, the first works were looking very much at agriculture, and they were saying, well, this is a sector where we know climate risk will have an impact, so let's calculate what the damage is. And I paraphrase it somewhat polemically. They said, well, worst case, maybe only half of food will remain, and that's 1 or 2% of global GDP. And then that's the message that gets out, and it sounds like, yeah, that's not a big problem. But of course, everyone here in the room, I assume, will know that if half the food were gone, the 1% GDP would be the least problem we'd need to worry about. There would be lots of knock-on effects. And so the Foresight is then a way to try to imagine without sort of having to quantify all the aspects and without having to sort of justify then why did you take this value or that value, to sort of imagine ourselves into a situation where we try to assess these second and third order risks and sort of bring home to decision makers the reality that this is an even bigger risk than the models, which are bad enough in their predictions that they predict.
Yeah, it's a great point, and a powerful example of how systemic and structured foresight can kind of help get ahead of those issues that are harder to quantify and address those third and fourth order effects that often are not incorporated into national level security strategies. Thank you. Sophie, I would like to bring you in next, particularly building on your experience around the intersection of science and policymaking. So could you please introduce yourself and maybe share some thoughts with regard to how foresight methodologies can help bridge the persistent gap between scientific climate evidence and policymaking?
Thank you, and good morning also from my side. I appreciate to be part of this passionate crowd on this very important topic. I'm a political scientist by training with a strong climate security focus, and up to recently I was part of the organizing team of the Munich Security Conference. Before that, I did research on climate security mainstreaming in the European Union, and I was also part of a GRC from the Joint Research Center public reform project on evidence-informed policymaking, where also one of the strands was strategic foresight, and that's where I got the experience and also the passion to bridge science and policymaking. And in regards to your question, we already heard yesterday a couple of times that when it comes to climate security, we operate with different communities. And indeed, we see separate bubbles and communities coming together when it comes to climate security. These operate with different priorities, they speak different languages. And I believe foresight, strategic foresight tools can be the perfect match to actually bridge these communities. Because we have the scientists which develop models over models. We have, however, also policymakers which need clear solutions. And lastly, we have society that struggle with all the new evidence and are trying to connect that somehow to their local and daily lives. So foresight would be an approach to bridge communities by overcoming the communication challenge, as I would frame it, as well as inclusiveness challenge. So strategic foresight can handle uncertainty and break down complexity, but it also can add multiple stakeholders at one table to conquer the challenges we face. So in regard to the understanding challenge or communication challenge, we see climate risks are complex, climate risks are uncertain. Scientists know somehow how to work with that. Policymakers do not like uncertainty. So foresight methods and especially scenario exercises could help to break down complex risks and turn them into tangible solutions. That also would help us to communicate differently. Instead of saying the sea level rise and the climate risk resulting from that will be unprecedented in the next coming years, we could communicate instead military bases will be flooded on a regular basis, will face risk by storm and seawater effects. So if we have climate risk assessments to quantify these impacts, we can then come together and policymakers, scientists and NATO planners can discuss what does readiness look like if 30% of our military bases are under risk. So this adds a more concrete scenario which can then turn into tangible actions. I come back to the inclusiveness challenge. The gap between the bubbles are not just becoming wider because we lack a common problem understanding, but it's getting harder to communicate across communities because of contestation of evidence, because of misinformation, because of undermining trust in institutions. So strategic foresight would be the unique opportunity, because strategic foresight only works if we get everyone on the table, if we make it a shared process, if we bridge knowledges. And this inclusiveness in the end can also lead to shared and problem understanding, but also shared ownership of the problem as well as the solution. We can also legitimize the decision-making process in a better way. Let's imagine, for example, a climate report with the newest evidence on the numbers of mass displacement. This climate report will be uploaded and perhaps eventually be dismissed. However, a foresight exercise on climate-driven migration, which includes scientists, NATO planners, as well as civil society organizations, could explore hands-on what does mass displacement due to a drought in the Sahel region actually means. So we could track what does that mean for the political stability in the region, what second and third order effect do we eventually see there. So if we have this development together, we get a co-understanding and we get ownership from all these different communities to eventually have a climate resilient idea of what the future looks like. So I believe strategic foresight can be very, very powerful to bridge the gap between scientists, policymakers, and eventually also get on board society, which is struggling, but which we are making policies for.
Thank you, Sophie. That's a great point. And your insights around how foresight can be used to legitimize more of the scientific evidence and these climate risk-informed policymaking really highlights a critical point I think we'll be exploring, especially through the different breakout sessions today too. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Corvaro. Turn to you for your diplomatic and international relations perspective. If you could please introduce yourself and speak to how foresight could be leveraged for integrating climate security into foreign policy and diplomatic efforts, and whether there are any examples of such that you could summarize.
So, good morning to everyone. It is a real great pleasure for me to be here with you. And my background is not a political or diplomatic background. I am a university professor, so I came from the scientific world. And from the beginning, for me, it was clear that there is a big gap, as you mentioned, between our world, the world of people that work on this topic, recognize the challenges, recognize that the climate change is not only an environmental issue, but is moreover a security challenge, and the political level. This for me was the real challenge during this job, to try to translate what we are saying in these conferences in a precise message for my political level. And this is really, really tough. In my opinion, when you have to speak about foresight, that is to anticipate the possible future, we need to recognize that in this moment there is a very different position between, on one end, who believe that climate change is a sort of religion, on the other hand, who other people that believes that doesn't exist. Why we are here? In my opinion, we are here because we sent in the past very wrong messages around climate change. And we use climate change as political leverage. Instead, this is not correct. Climate change is connected with scientific law, scientific research, and so on. So is something that is not correct to say, I believe. It's not a sort of faith. Is something that is happening. And after the last 2 weeks ago, after the UNGA, you had the opportunity to listen the speech of everyone. And after that, I believe that the topics that we are discussing here will increase its role for one reason. From my perspective, looking for COP30, I believe that the mitigation will receive a sort of slowing down, because we are seeing the new NDC. They are not so ambitious to achieve the Paris Agreement, the target of the Paris Agreement. So I believe that we have to expect a future with less investment in climate issue, unfortunately. On the other hand, if it is happening, and because climate change is happening, we need to recognize better our role, because the security aspect will become central. We need to prepare in some way the future of our nation to be prepared for new needs of adaptation. I know that it's not easy to explain this, and all my colleagues are working in this direction. But in some way, this is the common sentiment around what is happening around the world. And what I believe is that we need to find a way, investing in the education, in the information, to cover the gap between us and the political level. I heard what the Minister of Defense say, and this is really important. I would like to have in any country such position, because it's evident that he had the opportunity to touch with his hands the real consequences of climate change, because this is the issue. The consequences of climate change are affected the entire world, and in particular the most vulnerable country. In COP29, Italy, Germany, and some other countries decided to launch an initiative that is called Climate and Peace. The focus is to underline how the consequences of climate change, like water scarcity, food insecurity, land degradation, are connected with the conflicts in some specific area of the earth. And thanks to this conflict, we have a lot of migration. Italy is in the center of Mediterranean area. And this is the only, in this moment, this is the best way that I found to create a bridge with the political level, because everyone is able to recognize for his country the problems connected with migration. And this is a key, but it's only one. We need to invest more in clear information on the problems and the issues is connected with no action. No action is more expensive than other solutions that now we can use as an investment. Instead, in the next, 10 years, this became only cost for our nation. And I believe that we really have the duty to increase our voice, to put a real number, and to fight against disinformation around the world on the climate crisis.
Thank you, Professor. I think your point on how we need to not try to emphasize that you need to believe in what's happening, but actually recognize that that is the reality is a great point, especially highlighting where Foresight can come into play as a game designer and an exercise designer. That's often what I'm trying to capture through exercises, is that immersion quality, so that participants can kind of see themselves in that future and then be able to expand their mind in the present as to what's actually plausible, and develop policies in the present to tackle those plausible futures. I now want to shift to a more focused questions for each of you to explore how these foresight-driven approaches are evolving and kind of where key barriers or breakthroughs are emerging. I'm already seeing some great questions come in that I'll definitely draw on, but first I'd like to turn it to Esther. What are some of the institutional barriers to integrating climate risk assessments into daily policy decisions or even wider policy making? How might these be overcome from your experience?
Yeah, so, I loved what you were, both of you were just mentioning, and I think, I sum it up in my head as almost a failure of imagination, and I think that's where foresight can really make a difference. But, I think for some of the institutional barriers, I also actually want to go back and reference Aaron Sikorsky's wonderful talking points yesterday about the fact that we plan for the worst case scenario in so many other areas, but for some reason we can't do it for climate. And I think, and this is just, Esther Babson's opinion, but something I've been thinking about a lot is that existential dread that climate brings, and how hard it is for humans to absorb that, and I think to take action when it is so overwhelming and it is so existential. So, I think the other areas that those barriers that we have to break through beyond just the, human nature piece and the challenges there is also the components that Sophie actually mentioned as well, is the uncertainty. And you see this particularly in my time in the Pentagon with civil engineers and defense planners and acquisition officials. It is really hard for them to wrap their head around the idea of planning for something without specific parameters. And I think that's an area that we as a community want to keep improving on, is finding ways to really make it concrete and tangible for them. Because you can't expect a acquisition official that is figuring out how to design a future platform to design something and just tell them incorporate climate change. That's just not realistic. And you have to figure out how to help those individuals understand in a really tangible way of how they can incorporate it. So I think that's, on a lot of us to figure out how to translate that so that we break past, God bless civil engineers, but you really need to figure out how to make it translate into something that's usable for them instead of just telling them include climate change. And the last point I just want to make too on that is, I think this was brought up yesterday as well. And I know I'm coming from a previous experience and a different political world than my last role, but the importance of data and the importance of having equitable access to data, and hopefully, the fabulous databases that we have, and I know the Center of Excellence is doing a great job to try and compile a lot of that information, preserving as much as humanly possible. That might, not be forever. So trying to maintain that access to data so that we can take that and help break down some of those barriers that I was talking about earlier. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you for that. I think scenario exercise is always such an interesting opportunity to explore not only the worst case, but oftentimes the best case scenario, which startles people a little bit to have to conceive of that. But that's what I love about backcasting, especially, is working backwards to try and figure out how do we actually arrive to the best case. What can we do in the present to get there instead of only going and thinking about those black swan worst case scenario events. So thank you for that point. And actually, your point on data segues nicely into a question that I have for Benjamin, particularly looking at the Nike Consortium as an example. Could you maybe summarize the consortium a little bit? I know you did in your introduction, but speaking to the importance of integrated risk assessments and how Foresight can be utilized as a guide for strategic thinking on potential risk dynamics in the ways that you described it. It can help that quantified data reach the right kinds of ears and policymakers.
Yeah, I'll be happy to try. So if you look at what the assessment says, it's essentially structured in sort of 3 levels of risk. The first one is sort of the direct impacts on Germany of climate change. And it's an area that you can fairly well sort of assess based on more traditional climate risk assessments, right? You can look back into the past at least to see what the damage has been over the past 20 years from extreme weather events. It's about 145 billion euros, but of course it depends always on how exactly you calculate what do you count, what do you not count. But it's in some ways quantifiable. We know it's going to get worse. We don't necessarily know by how much. A lot will depend on how we react and anticipate. But that gives you a sense. So that part was sort of very much dealt with by the sort of climate science part of our consortium, which was the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So we basically synthesized their findings on the impacts of climate change. Then there is sort of a second level of risk, which is what direct climate impacts would we have elsewhere in the world that then come back to haunt us, right? And that's much harder to quantify, because while we might be able to assess the impact somewhere else, how much of that actually comes back is much harder to know, because it interacts in many ways. So here already it becomes much more of a foresight exercise to sort of think through what are potential risk pathways, and what do we make of them. And that's also, there was of course a lot more discussion on this in the consortium than on the models. You just have to kind of believe the modelers, unless you are a modeler yourself and can properly engage. And then there's the third level, which is sort of the indirect system level impacts, and that's of course the hardest to grasp. But I believe, and I think the consortium shared that, it might be the biggest of them all. So right, what does it do to the system, to the international system we have? And here one of the challenges we encounter in trying to communicate is that I think many people find it hard to imagine how much we are interdependent in many ways, right? And how much of our business model, specifically in Germany, but also in much of the developed world, depends on the sort of relatively certain expectations of what norms shape the behavior of in international politics that were sort of prevalent over the past decades. How much it is built on this. That if you take this away, the costs are immense. And I mean, we can witness this as some of these norms are eroding right now. What this means in terms of resource reallocation and how big this is. And of course, climate change is a very big driver of this. But this is where the foresight becomes the most important, because a lot of the research on the impacts is focusing very much on the climate part of climate change, right? And not so much on the change part. Now, of course, historically we know change in the international system is what is really driving conflict, is driving uncertainty. Change in the balance of power means that people try to anticipate, feel the urge to act now before it's too late, right? And sort of, so this change part is much harder to grasp in any model. So you have to sort of think through and come up with ideas such as, what does it mean to the legitimacy of the system when there's an obvious huge injustice in how who caused climate change and who's paying the price. If the system is unable to address this injustice and is visibly unable to address, what does it mean in terms of overall system legitimacy? And then thinking about, what if then a part of the international system just pulls the plug and says, "Oh, this doesn't work. We need something new," and all bets are off, right? And of course, that is really, really hard to quantify. And of course, there were lots of discussions. How do we put this? And I still find it really hard to communicate, because either you sound extremely educational, trying to go through all the hoops and sort of, do we agree on this? Do we agree on that? Do we agree on a third point? Or it just remains slightly, difficult to grasp.
Thank you for that. I want to pick a point that you'd mentioned on how the systems level analysis in your assessment really emphasized interdependencies. And I think going back to Sophie, you also mentioned that foresight is a way to highlight interdependencies, but also cooperation through such. If we see that we're all interconnected, and therefore the solutions have shared ownership, as well as the risks that we've all taken part in creating as well. I want to jump on that point a little bit and ask you, what role do participatory foresight methods play in strengthening the legitimacy of such climate risk assessments, especially at that systems-wide level? And how can these approaches evolve to better capture widening future uncertainties, and who's managing such uncertainties?
Thank you. Yeah, I truly believe that strategic foresight is not just a tool to develop climate-resilient futures, but also to maybe democratize our decision-making processes. Because of the inclusion of many stakeholders, as I stated earlier, we can increase ownership. We can also increase the acceptance of climate risk assessment, as it features different perspectives on climate risk impact. But to have these different insights, we need also to include indigenous and local knowledge, because we also heard yesterday, they have oftentimes the practical understanding of the environment, which adds to the scientific evidence. When we also make the foresight process and the decision-making process more transparent, we can counter the undermining trust issues and the contestedness of science and the ongoing misinformation. So eventually trust can grow between institutions and communities again when we involve stakeholders and develop a shared understanding and knowledge. There was a great example of a participatory foresight approach in Honduras. Honduras is one of the most affected countries by climate change, with the agricultural sector being immensely prone and vulnerable to climate risk. And they developed a climate strategy for agriculture. And after a first draft, they stress tested this through a scenario analysis with farmers, academics, government officials, the private sector, and civil society. So they came together and had this original and diverse insight from different stakeholders to improve the strategy. And beyond that, the strategy became more future resilient. It also fostered the general collaboration between government and civil society organization, which I think this is where strategic foresight tools can really come into play. And when we talk about how can we involve it to address uncertainty in a better way, so now I'm repeating myself, but widen the participation, get all your stakeholders on board. That includes not just civil society actors, local communities, non-traditional security actors. We can also feature here a more broader understanding of security than we have maybe just the defense and national security understanding here. Then integrate multiple knowledge system. I already said indigenous knowledge, but also practitioner insights as well as scientific knowledge. And I think we need to see foresight not just as a one-time exercise, but something we regularly integrate and apply, maybe even in form of a science office next to the Prime Minister's office, which continuously makes the link between scientific communities, civil society organizations, and the practitioners and policymaking people in the government. And then we can also explore links between AI and foresight methodologies and climate risk assessment, if it's promising and where useful and appropriate. I think this can leverage the tools and strategies as well. And lastly, maybe as a call to action, be bold. Start using it. Start integrating it systematically. I think we can form a community of practitioners here, and the more we use it, the more we adapt to it, and it doesn't counter our intuitions anymore. So be bold.
Thank you for that point. It's inspiring. I think too, on your saying building the use and the practitioner itself will really help to build legitimacy of foresight as an approach, and also the ways in which it's applied to things such as climate security risks. I'd like to turn it over to Francesco to build on Sophie's point a little bit, because the more we use these tools and encourage people to use these tools, it's almost building that will to look more into the future and expand your assumptions on what is plausible. So where do you see the greatest opportunity to kind of build up that political will, and maybe also pulling from a question I have here from the audience, a social will, so those that aren't necessarily in the room today, but turning to the public and to society that we design these policies for, where do you see the greatest opportunity to build that will for accelerated climate mitigation and actually addressing some of these legitimate science evidence-backed risk assessments?
So thanks for the question. I would like to start with an example about how it is possible, if we are able to touch the correct way in the political level, to change the scenario that we have in front of us. So in the center of Italy, there is an area that is the Appennino area, where we had a very bad earthquake in 2016. And the government decided to invest a lot of money to repair this area. That was a mountain area, so with very few people. And we would like not only to rebuild, because if you have an house with anyone inside, is not a good solution, but also to offer a new kind of population, a new kind of opportunity to recall people and youth in particular. And we decided to invest in the new technology that we have. We invest in energy community system with renewable energy, with digitalization, and so on. And using this new technology, we recognize that the result was very good. We are seeing a new life in this area. And moreover, as yesterday I heard the final remarks from Ukraine, the importance of renewable energy also from a resilience point of view. In this area, we had this right now. So for me, this is an example of this fact. The real barrier to climate action is not the technology, it's the political level. We need to work in this direction. It's the only way that we have. And in this case, what was the real differences was a comparison between the cost of doing something in the old style and instead using the new technology. And I believe that the private sector could be the real leverage in this direction, because there is a sort of, how do you say, dedication is not correct, but a lot of new companies believes that this is the good way and they want to invest. We found private sector company to invest for the first time in this rural area. Never happens in the past. Because what they was, the real idea that won, in my opinion, in this case, is this new approach to use the new technology to rebuild this area that was destroyed in the past. So for me, we need to use our diplomatic system and our capabilities to discuss, to convince the political level on this. And moreover, we need to work on the public opinion. I understood the one thing that probably for you is easy, but for me was a sort of discovery, that the political level is really connected, and they decide to move if they receive a good sentiment from the public opinion, voters, in some very easy way to translate. And I believe that yesterday I participated to a panel on disinformation and so on. This is the real bad things that we have right now. With the new technologies that we have, from TikTok to Facebook to everyone, it's possible to read anything. You can find a lot of things on the website. And it is difficult to keep the correct message inside this. I saw this with my daughters. I pass a lot of evening with them to speak about climate, because sometimes they can see some video on YouTube that has no scientific background, but they are able to convince of everything. So our world is very complex from this point of view, but we need to move. And I believe that this kind of conference, and in particular the role of NATO in this case, is crucial, because the connection between climate and national security could be one of the best leverage to convince the political level that it's time, really time, to use the new possibility that we have to invest in this sector and also protect our countries from the consequences of the climate change.
Thank you for that point. I wanted to open up to the audience questions and kind of have this be a wider discussion, but pulling on what you just said about your example and how your daughters are showing YouTube videos that don't have scientific backing but somehow manage to capture their attention is a great segue into this question on the high burden of proof that climate risks must meet to justify action for policymakers. How can Foresight help specifically address that high burden of proof in such a muddled information environment where we're riddled with dis and misinformation that often obfuscate fact from fiction and kind of distract from that hard scientific evidence and maybe point in the direction of something that's false or incorrect. So how can we balance that dilemma? And specifically, Foresight, how can it help to address the uniquely high burden of proof that climate risks must meet to justify action on the policy level side? I'll turn it to all of you if you have thoughts, if anyone has anything specific that they want to jump into.
You want to go?
No, you feel.
I mean, maybe just a very first comment, like, I don't think we should accept that, right? Why should we accept that sort of differentiated treatment on treating one of the risks as sort of requiring a much higher burden of proof than many others? I always try to push back on this because, right, of course it comes up a lot, but we aren't sure that this is going to happen, and this, it may not be quite as bad. But of course, if we are in the security sector, I mean, most of the risks are, or big risks are low probability, and yet, we spend a lot of money and thoughts and so on to prevent, to deter, and possibly defend against them. So why would we do this differently with climate? I think it's more of a sort of a hurdle to truly fully accept that this is just as much or even more of a security risk than the traditional security risks are. And I just wanted to also hark back to Aaron's point yesterday on sort of comparing, the impacts actually of climate change to, terrorism as one of the sort of somewhat hyped security threats. And of course, it's a much smaller. It's a much smaller number of affected people. Of course, it's also different in terms of the intent that comes with this, but there is. I think we need to push back collectively against the idea that the lives lost to and the wealth lost to climate change is somewhat lower in the social hierarchy because an environmental problem, not a security problem. That's why we try to connect them.
Great. Esther, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think the challenge is just the mentality around it, and I think Foresight definitely can. But your second part of the question, talking about how Foresight can help with that, I think it can build what I mentioned earlier around that imagination and using Foresight as a way to hopefully take something that feels very ambiguous and overwhelming and translate it into something that is more tangible for individuals to wrap their head around and to understand how this really can impact them. And I think of it in the same way as we're, finally starting to include energy as part of our analysis when we're looking at future platforms or when we're wargaming. In the past, it was just a hand waving of, well, if you run out of energy, we'll figure it out. and you can't operate that way. And I think we're finally starting to see that change in wargaming and Foresight to have energy and climate factors included as part of that. So I think Foresight is a really powerful tool, but it just is a fundamental challenge of that it is a high burden of proof. And, again, I'm sure the social scientists have lots more thoughts to say on why that is, but I think it's going to continue to be a challenge. And unfortunately, I think it's only going to increase in challenge to have the focus on climate because of the fact that we have so many other disasters right in our face or situations around the world that unfortunately with a climate change world are only going to intensify. So it's going to be continuously and increasingly hard to maintain that focus on the future, I think, unfortunately.
And let me jump in here. Yes, we have uncertainty when it comes to climate risk, but we have uncertainty in terms of the intensity of the impact and when the impact will happen. So we're not sure how bad it will be, but we can already know it is bad.
Yeah.
So strategic foresight for me is here a tool to communicate in a very practical way through scenarios, for example, how it will unfold, because this is something we're not so sure about it, but we have the evidence, we have the examples. I mean, all over the world, we have the speeches from yesterday outlined it in all different fields, how climate change is already affecting. So it is uncertain, but it's not that uncertain as people might argue.
I totally agree with you, and this is what I am doing. And moreover, I can add only one thing. One of my mission right now is to speak with the youth. The younger generation is ready, really ready to understand clearly this message. We need to beat on them. It's crucial. And I am working a lot because they have also a lot of proposals in this direction, more than some political level. So I believe that is one of the possibility that we have. And as you say, it's crucial to say that the uncertain is not about if, at least when and how much, and this how much is connected with the decision that you can take or not. But for sure, as I told, climate change is not the end of the world, but is something that's happening. And with a society so complex as the one that we have, for us, it will be a lot of money. The translation is a lot of money to put on this issue if we are not able to do something now.
Great points. Kind of tying into this a little bit about, it sounds like there's almost an overwhelming amount of uncertainty, even though we're in alignment that not everything is as uncertain as we may make it out to be. But it seems like, Esther, to what you were saying, it's really challenging to prioritize then when we have, especially when in the climate space, when we have so many ongoing security priorities and risks, especially as it relates to defense and national security and all of these competing priorities. Pulling on a question from the audience with regard to that complexity, how would you advise to balance complexity versus prioritization, and who needs to take the lead? Seems like a challenging
That's
question.
Quite an abstract question.
I have another challenging question on how would you explain foresight to 5-year-olds, but
Oh, good.
I was going to save that for
Yeah,
later.
You know, it's incredibly hard, and I think the translation work that I talked about earlier, I think, is a key part of it. You know, my work in a former life and when I was in a think tank was taking, retired generals to talk about climate change in venues where maybe that wasn't as common for them to hear from a 2-3-star general about climate change. So I think in balancing the complexity piece for I think the broader audience, I think sometimes it's meeting people where they are, and it's finding the right communicator so that you have someone that's translating into a way that they understand. And so sometimes that is meeting people and what their priorities are, rather than necessarily how in a foresight context we would think about prioritization in terms of like the most likely scenario. And for that side, that's why foresight requires bringing in the scientists, bringing in defense planners, bringing in all these different people so that you have a really clear picture of what maybe what the most likely situation is, and prioritizing that rather than getting distracted by either the best or worst case scenario and just assuming that. So anyone else want to try and tackle? Nope.
No, I found that really clarifying on the nuance that needs to be built in. I think to meet people where they're at and understand that there is nuance with differing priorities, and I think that's what's great about scenario planning exercises is often if you use that method where you have a 2x2 matrix is what it's called, and you emerge with 4 different scenarios, 2 at the polar end of the spectrum, a best and a worst case, and then 2 that are in between. I often find in running them that the 2 in between are really where all of the meat is at, and people disagree the most as to how that variability could play out, but that's often where we emphasize and actually get to identify the differences in priorities and what's important for some in terms of like the policy side might be different from the subject matter experts in the room who are completely on a different page when it comes to how those more nuanced scenarios could play out. So that's a great point, and I may go to the 5-year-old question now because that we have lots more. But this was just on how can you kind of persuade skeptical colleagues that foresight is valuable and that they should try it. There's another question from the audience about how do you get those that aren't in the room necessarily interacting with these types of tools and methodologies to consume their outputs? How do you translate those outputs maybe to the wider public or to audiences that weren't represented in the actual exercises? And so again, how would you also explain foresight to 5-year-olds if anyone wants to jump into that one?
Well, I guess for the first part of the question of the skeptical colleagues and bringing the value clearly, I mentioned it earlier. A huge part of my role is building an operational concept to take all of these documents and to build it into something that's really actionable. And I think that is a key piece that we need to focus on in a foresight community. Foresight analysis is not the end of the road. You have to take it further and you have to bring it into a really practical use. Because if you just, I can create paperweights all day. I can create documents and they can sit on a shelf. And that is not the role of what this work should be. It should be taking it and then figuring out how to make it actionable. And that is not easy. But I think that is where you really show the value to defense planners is when you take it and you show them how they can apply it. So I think that's where you show the value, and someone else want to explain how you explain it to a 5-year-old, but.
Maybe just a quick comment on that. How do you persuade people? Just by trying it out and letting the evidence and the process speak by itself. And I was in this reform project with the OECD and the Joint Research Center on evidence-informed policymaking. There we had workshops bridging the community, so bringing in scientists as well as policymakers. And the realization which hit there was amazing. And afterwards, I think every individual was aware of the benefit they would gain from each other. And now I'm speaking for myself, but I thought that they say, okay, now I don't want to do it ever otherwise again and stay in my silo, because they really realized the moment they were together in a room and they had first tools at hand, how beneficial it will be for their work, for better policies, and eventually also for more societal trust.
If I can add, I believe that we have to accept also a comparison with the other people that are skeptical, but starting from something that my mother said a lot of time, we not be afraid about the fact that, for example, we studied in the past. So in this new world, it seems that everything is a show. You can say everything, but most of us dedicates a lot of hours to study, to understand which is the problem. And with not a position of Superman, it's not this, but we need to start from this. We have a scientific background, we have different background, but normally we prepared our life to do some jobs, and this is a value. Even if we have YouTube and everyone can earn money with a different way, the value of our knowledges are not neglectable. We need to start from this. We need to discover again these properties, and with not any idea of superior position, but we need to start from this and try a way to simplify a complex things like the climate change. Is not so complex because is at the base between one of the most important relationship, human life and his habitat, his earth. We believe that we are Superman because our technologies give us this idea, but the relationship between nature and human life is really important, and we can't avoid this connection.
Can I just add one more
Yeah,
thing
of
too? I think I was thinking about how we further prove it. I also think we have to really highlight examples where this has worked. So, for example, Finland 20 years ago decided to build a facility to store spent nuclear fuel, and they're working. So, in theory, it should store for 100,000 years, and we can talk about that with other professionals that actually know the science around it. But this was a foresight exercise. This was taking 20 years ago, determining that this is going to be something that we will need in the world, and now they're going to be taking on a lot of that, that waste. And again, we can talk about nuclear in a separate conversation, but I think we have to celebrate those wins of where people have looked into the future and figured out how to plan, leading to success. So I think that's something we should also highlight as well.
Yeah, I really like the points on the value add, both in the outputs from Foresight, so examples such as the Finnish example that you just gave, and to the professor's point on the value add. I think what we were all just explaining is often Foresight affords such a value add through its experiential learning toolkit and actually engaging in the activities. And I think I'd personally answer the how would you explain it to a 5-year-old question as I wouldn't necessarily explain it, I would just allow them to play and engage. As a war gamer, that's often really heavily tied to behavioral science, and there's massive studies looking into play and the importance of immersion and those qualities, and actually getting people to buy into something that they wouldn't have otherwise bought into until they actually engage with the activity, or were put into a simulation that they couldn't otherwise conceive of in their own mind. So great points, and I think on that value add thread, we have time for about one more question. And there's one here from the audience on how governments and policymakers listen to their security and intelligence services. Where is the great push to mainstream, and this is for Benjamin, what Adelphi did with the BND across NATO? And then I might open it up to the rest of the panelists for final remarks on kind of integrating that security and intelligence services, and where does Foresight add value there?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's maybe a little early to tell because it's not that old. It was only published earlier this year, and of course these processes take some time. Now, what I would hope to be able to backcast then at some point would that other countries or institutions try as well, and sort of because I think the process is probably more important than the eventual product for getting the different stakeholders to think through what it means for them, and because these stakeholders usually in their sector know so much more about how these impacts might actually play out, affect them, and where their levers are for addressing them. But then the next point is that this study is just that. It's a risk assessment, and so it's not looking at how in each policy sector these risks would be addressed. And that's, of course, had we tried to do this, it would have taken us 10 years. It would not have been complete because we have these very intricate governance systems everywhere, which are very strongly performing, but which means that it's really hard from the outside to sort of say, well, in terms of disaster risk reduction, here's what you should do, because I don't know enough about everything that's already out there, has been thought about and maybe put aside, and so on. Right? That's for that sector to sort of come back and say, okay, given these risks, it would be really interesting to sort of replicate the process, but very specifically, geographically, and thematically. And I am hopeful that that some of that will happen and might also come back to the consortium for sort of further taking down. Because if you now read the report, since it's global and on everything, it hopefully leaves you wanting for more. If you get like one paragraph on, what's the geopolitical risks of unilateral geoengineering. Of course, there's much more that could be said. It's just sort of trying to touch all the bases.
Great point. Any other final contributions from our panelists up here on that thread?
Maybe to just jump on the 5 years old question. I would explain it to a kid like this. You're not thinking about what might happen tomorrow exactly, or you don't know what tomorrow will happen, but start envisioning what your tomorrow will look like. Start dreaming. I think foresight exercise can be a structured dreaming exercise to think about where do we want to be tomorrow in 10 years, in 50 years, and then to backcast, okay, what do I have to do now that I will end up with my dream?
And to foot stomp on what I know I've repeated a few times, and then operationalize it, and then take that analysis and take it to that next step.
Well, thank you for ending on such an optimistic note for this first plenary session. That brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you to all of our panelists up here for such a rich and multifaceted discussion. I think you've helped us all see how foresight, when applied thoughtfully, can act as both a bridge and a catalyst, bridging gaps between data and decision making, between science and policy, between institutions and the communities they serve. And as a catalyst, it can shift how we frame risks and challenge our own assumptions. And what we heard today really reinforces my belief, not just as a biased practitioner, but that the use of such frameworks as foresight is not just a technical exercise anymore, it's a strategic imperative. So thank you again to everyone up here and for Casco. And thank you for engaging with us, the audience, on this opening conversation.